I've been given 20 minutes to talk about something that usually takes me hours. So I'm going to paint with a very broad brush and expect that if I didn't cover something that you wanted to cover with regard to Islam, there's a Q&A time, I think, at 6:30. So I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm kind of a Luddite, and I'm actually kind of too dumb to use PowerPoint effectively. So I'm just going to go. I've got a series of questions I want to deal with regard to Islam, and we'll just roll right through them. The first is, what is Islam? Typically, we refer to Islam as a religion. Lots of people talk about the religion of Islam, and certainly there is an aspect to Islam that would suggest it's a religion, but it's actually much bigger than that. You could call it a worldview that is ideological, or you could just call it what Muslims typically call it. It's an ideology. That is to say, it's all-encompassing. It's not just a view of things and a view of God. It actually asserts, if you will, dogma or doctrine about how you should live. And we're talking about very particular things: what you should eat, what you can't eat, how you should get along with your spouse, what you can do to your spouse if she's a bit disobedient. It has doctrines or dogmas about not just government existing for our good, but what type of government, what sort of policies should be in place. And of course, it's got a lot to say about God as well. So it's an ideology, but more importantly to its sort of ideology is it has a particular, it's a fancy term, teleology. It has a particular goal or purpose or end in mind. The Qur'an's pretty clear on this. I don't know how many of you have read the Qur'an. Chances are, if you've read it, you probably didn't get too far in it because it's like one of the most difficult books to read, not because it's so sublime and full of wisdom, but because it's a pain in the rear to read. It's so disorderly and chaotic. But if you look at the Quranic text, one thing that sticks out pretty clear over the course of its 114 chapters is that it envisions a future for Muslims where, as Quran chapter 9 puts it, Islam prevails over everything else. That's the goal, the telos, or the end point of Islam, to dominate everything else. And we're not just talking religious domination, we're talking legal, political, social, and so on down the line. Now, a bit of good news in a very temporal sense. While Islam has this sort of overarching idea of what should be in time and space, and while certainly there are lots and lots of Muslims who are striving towards that through what's called jihad, it's sort of become a household word. Jihad it's an Arabic term that simply means to struggle. It doesn't necessarily mean a physical, violent struggle. It could be a legal struggle. It could be a cultural struggle where Muslims try to persuade those of us who are a bit worried about Islam that Islam is a religion of peace and so on. Interestingly, in Islam right now, in the 21st century, and I'm going to have a slight liberal moment here, the good news is, in an American context, and it's slight good news, is that most Muslims are absolutely clueless about the teachings of Islam. And chances are, you young people, if you have Muslim friends, if you go to school with them perhaps, or maybe you work with them, chances are they're largely ignorant of what Islam really is about. What that means, why I say that's good news, is because it means that you can actually have conversations with them. Your real hardcore ideological Muslim probably isn't going to spend any time with you. In fact, the Quran says that you're to always prefer the company of Muslims over other people. You're to have nothing to do with the infidels. But most Muslims aren't like that, thankfully. You have maybe Turkish or Persian friends who maybe they don't even go to mosque on Friday. So there is this reality. One of the biggest, for Christians, the biggest problems we have with regard to talking about Islam as a Christian in the public arena is we've got to be very careful in the distinctions we make. When we talk about Islam as a religion of violence, which it is very much a religion of violence if you look at the Quranic text, Historically speaking, 1,400 years, Islam has always taught that Muslims are to fight against the unbelievers, the people of the book, Christians and Jews, until they believe in Allah on the last day or submit to Islam. Most Muslims, again, thankfully, aren't even aware of that sort of thing, right? So what this means is for us, in our conversations, as we talk about Islam, we've got to be a bit careful, because what we have, with the number of Muslims in the United States increasing, and they are increasing in number. We don't know exactly how many Muslims are here. If you ask one group, they'll say 5 million. If you ask the Council on American Islamic Relations, they'll say 15 million. It's maybe somewhere in between. But if you look at the institutions of Islam here in the U.S., from 1990, where we had about 30 mosques in our country, to present, where we have over 3,000, it suggests that Islam is on the increase. So what it means is we're going to have lots of, probably into the future, you young people are going to have conversations with Muslims, or you're certainly going to be talking about it. And I think it's important for us as Christians to make a distinction between Islam as an ideology that should be resisted at every corner, but also recognize the basic, if you will, sociological fact or demographic fact that a lot of Muslims don't really buy into the whole ideological package of Islam. Now, let's say you young people have conversations with Muslims. Maybe you have a Muslim friend. What do we talk about with Muslims? What do we confess before a Muslim? First, we need to do a little bit of work on what sort of some essential ingredients with regard to Islam when it comes to its religion. First and foremost, Islam is a monotheistic religion. It teaches that there is no God, there is nothing worthy of worship but Allah. And a Muslim will tell you Allah is one being, right? Just because Islam is monotheistic, though, it asserts that there's one God, does not mean that Christians and Muslims, and throw Jews in there too, worship in some sense the same God. Muslims are very clear, at least when they're talking to themselves, that God is one in essence in Islam, but he's also one in person. The Qur'an is very clear on this in several places. It says that Allah is one. He does not have a son, nor could he have a son. He has no female consort. The Qur'an explicitly, in one passage, rejects the doctrine of the Trinity. So while you'll hear, I think it was about a year ago, there was this big brouhaha at Wheaton College in Illinois over whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God because Muslims are monotheists and Christians are monotheists. It's not the same God they envision. They do not worship the Son of God, Jesus Christ, right? So don't get confused. Don't be confused, but don't be, because it's kind of politically correct. Don't feel like you have to assert that just because Muslims are monotheists, they must worship the same sort of God. That just simply isn't the case. A Muslim himself, him or herself, if they're part of the tradition of Islam, won't even say that. So they don't worship the same God. It is monotheistic, to be sure. They also have other things within Islam, or there's things within the Quran that look kind of Christian in character. If you read the Quran, one of the surprising things for first-time readers is you'll encounter a lot of biblical names in the Quran. Adam, Abraham, John the Baptist, even Jesus. In fact, Jesus is named more in the Quran than Muhammad. Even Jesus' mother Mary is named. So there's a lot of terminology that is shared between Christians and Muslims, but the way a Muslim thinks about these people and similar terminology that Christians have is they completely reinterpret it. So, for example, in the case of Jesus, the Quran says that Jesus was born to Mary, who was a virgin. And in fact, in this chapter in the Quran, chapter 19, you learn that not only was Jesus born of a virgin, but he also, as he grew up, performed all sorts of miracles. He healed the sick, restored sight to the blind, he even raised the dead. The Quran even adds an additional miracle that's not found in the canonical Gospels. It says on one occasion, Jesus to impress his friends, he took a clay pigeon Not the stuff you shoot with shotguns, but like a trinket. The stuff my wife buys a lot. I shouldn't have said that because I'm being reported on live. And he took it, a clay pigeon, and breathed on it, and all of a sudden it became alive and flew off. So you get a virgin-born Jesus who performed lots of miracles, even miracles that we're not even aware of. You get a Jesus who the Qur'an suggests he had a band of disciples. And here's where things get interesting. Towards the end of Jesus' life, in the Qur'an, and from an Islamic vantage point, we read that on the night before Jesus was to be betrayed, he's in the upper room with his disciples. And the Qur'an's kind of unclear on this, but Quranic commentaries say they're sitting around at a table, and Jesus asks his disciples, he knows because in Islam he's a prophet. He's regarded as a prophet of Islam. He knows the authorities are coming for him. So Jesus looks around the room and says, do any of you want to take my place when I'm arrested? And you probably can guess who maybe raised his hand. Judas says, I'll do it, Lord. And the commentary suggests, building on the Quranic text, that all of a sudden Judas's face was transformed. A kind of a divine facelift took place. And when the authorities came, Judas was arrested. Jesus had actually disappeared. The Quran says he was taken up into heaven. And here's the real dividing line between Muslims and Christians that's especially important when it comes to conversations with Muslims. Because what we do as Christians is is confess Christ to people. In Islam, there's a view that Jesus, and it's from Quran chapter 4, verse 157 and 158, if you want to look it up. The Quran says Jesus was not crucified, nor did he die. Instead, he was taken up into heaven. So for a Muslim, if you're going to confess Christ before a Muslim, maybe you're going to tell them that Christ died for them, which is what you should tell them. Don't be surprised when they respond by saying maybe, oh, that's nice for you, or something like that. Don't be surprised when they respond and say, no, he didn't. He didn't die in the first place. And then the conversation with regard to Christian-Muslim discourse all of a sudden changes. You're going to find, I don't know what you think of this, actually don't care what you think of it, but you're going to find in conversations with Muslims, you're going to be required 9 times out of 10 to give some sort of an apologetic for Christianity, a defense of Christianity. Muslims, at least traditional-minded Muslims, believe Christianity is false. They believe it's built on a false history that's been invented over time, and you're going to find that their objections to the gospel, sure, they're theological, but at the bottom, they're ultimately historical. Christianity is not true, says a Muslim, because Jesus didn't didn't die on a cross, therefore he didn't rise from the dead. Right? The Bible itself tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, our faith is a scam. You know, we're the most pitiable of all people because we're going to die in our sins. That's Francisco's paraphrase of 1 Corinthians 15. So if Christ did not die on a cross and didn't rise, they're right. It's not true. And this is where the conversation will go, especially with young Muslims. We're talking 20s and 30s who have been living in the U.S. and they know there's a lot of hostility and antagonism towards Islam. They've done a tremendous amount of work and pumped out a tremendous amount of literature and produced media. There's a YouTubeislam.com channel that trains young Muslims how to go after especially Christianity. And they go after it not theologically but historically. So you'll find in a Muslim context, or if you're standing before Islam, giving a bold witness to the faith, to the gospel, you're going to also have to give a reason for the hope within you, as 1 Peter 3:15, and not just encourage it, but exhorts all of us Christians. So how do you do that? I don't know how much time I have left. I think I got about 5 minutes. Perfect. How do you do that? How do you bear witness to the gospel in the face of Islam if a Muslim has rejected that Jesus died on the cross? Well, you shift into apologetics. How do you do apologetics in a Muslim context? It's actually quite easy, because the big hang-up is Christ's crucifixion. Why do we all believe that Christ was crucified on a cross? Why do we believe it? Because we feel it in our heart? I hope that's not the only reason you believe Jesus died on a cross. How do we know Jesus actually died on a cross? We know from eyewitness testimony, companions of eyewitnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We also know from non-Christian sources. Study just a little bit of apologetics and you'll learn there's actually hostile sources from the Greco-Roman world that confirm some of our beliefs about what happened to Jesus. You find in Tacitus and Suetonius, two Roman authors, late 1st, early 2nd century, who absolutely hated Christianity. That it's a matter of fact, everybody knows, according to them, that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Josephus, a Jew, who hated Christianity not as much as the Romans, but still hated it, who acknowledges it as a matter of historical fact. And being able to engage in that sort of conversation with a Muslim is of the essence. And it also is very beneficial, kind of socially, I guess, or socially speaking, because when you're talking about historical things, you can push the theology to the side a bit, or at least put it on the back burner, right? We all want to talk theology, but in the context of Muslim-Christian discourse, things get heated up pretty quickly. You're talking history, you're in common ground. And from there, you can make a case that there's good reason to believe Jesus died on a cross, contrary to what a book that was written 600 years after it says. And moreover, if he did die on a cross, if there's good historical evidence that he did, it leads to another question. Why did he die on a cross? And then you've got the golden opportunity, the thing you want to tell a Muslim. He died on a cross as a propitiation, as a substitute for us, for our sins. But not only for our sins. 1 John 2:2 says, for the sins of the whole world. And that includes the Muslim world. So I know I didn't want to, and I'm not going to. I figured probably a lot of people wanted to talk about the immigration issue, right? This alleged Muslim ban that Trump issued a couple, 2 weeks ago now, I think. We're not going to talk about that. But Islam, because of these sorts of things, is always on everybody's radar screen. And I'm the worst example of it, but there is, for Christians, thinking about Islam, thinking about the possibility that we might have the opportunity to speak the gospel to a Muslim, we kind of have to walk a tight line. We have to recognize that Islam does pose a major challenge to us politically, legally, and otherwise. The jihad that's been taking place for 15 years now, since September 11, 2001, isn't just being fought with bombs and guns and knives and other things. It's also being fought on a cultural level. Let me recommend something to you. If you, all you young people know YouTube, of course. Go there and type in the third jihad, and you'll see a documentary done by a Muslim, a very liberal-minded Muslim, who says you need to wake up, Americans, and be aware that there's a jihad going on underneath your very nose, where Muslim groups are using democracy and public opinion to advance the cause of Islam. We got to be aware of that very much, but at the same time, we also have to be aware that there are Muslims here who aren't connected to all that stuff, thankfully, and there are Muslims here who desperately need to hear the gospel, because if there's one thing about Islam, just spend a little time reading into it, it is a religion of works righteousness par excellence. The Muslim feels day in and day out the pressure of the law, from what they can eat, how they should treat their sisters or their mom or their dad, to what's required of them publicly in terms of dress and so on and so forth. So with the rise of Islam, the number of Muslims here in the U.S., those sorts of opportunities for you young people in particular are going to present themselves in an increasing amount in the subsequent decades to come. Thank you.